There are places where the ground forgets the names of the dead. Sacred Heart is one of them. They will tell you it was a seminary, a house of God, nestled among the gentle hills of Illinois. But what they won't tell you is this: over 18 years, 20 young priests vanished, no funerals, no graves, no investigations, just gone, and the church said nothing. Why? Because some institutions aren't just hiding sins, they are built on them. You were never meant to hear this, and once you do, you won't sleep the same. This isn't folklore, it's not fiction. These disappearances happened, and the deeper we go, the more you'll realize this wasn't a fluke. It was a system, a machine, a ritual, a cathedral not of faith, but of power, every brick soaked in secrets, every prayer echoing with a lie. And now, after 150 years of silence, the buried truth is starting to rot its way to the surface. So if you're the kind of man who senses there's more, something darker beneath the world you see, stay with me. But understand this: there is no turning back, because this isn't just about missing priests. This is about a machine of obedience, crafted with holy words and stained glass, built to condition minds, hide atrocities, and harvest souls. From the moment those 20 young men walked into Sacred Heart, they were marked, not for ministry, but for disappearance. And the worst part, they never even knew it, until it was far too late. You think you've heard all the Church's darkest secrets. No, you haven't. The Vatican buried this for a reason. They sealed the archives, silenced witnesses, destroyed records, and replaced memory with myth. But one letter survived, one letter hidden beneath a chapel floorboard, and it changes everything. This is the story of the 20 priests who disappeared, and of the men who wore collars but served no God you've ever prayed to. We begin in 1847, but before we go back, ask yourself, are you ready to remember what the world worked so hard to make you forget? 1847 wasn't just another year. It was the opening of a wound. The United States was expanding, cities were swelling, and the Catholic Church saw an opportunity and a threat. Millions of Irish immigrants fled famine and death in their homeland, pouring into the slums of Boston, Chicago, and New York, desperate for salvation, direction, belonging. The Church offered them that, or so it claimed, but institutions never expand without appetite, and Sacred Heart Seminary was born out of that hunger. Founded 40 miles outside Chicago, it wasn't just a school, it was a fortress, an outpost, a place to mold young men into tools for the Church's mission in the New World. But what mission, exactly? Father Edmund Walsh arrived that year with a silver beard and iron eyes, a man said to have studied at Trinity College, fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and fluent in obedience. He brought with him 2 companions, Thomas Murphy, a canon law scholar from Belgium, and Patrick O'Brien, a charismatic rhetorician trained in the Royal University of Ireland. They were admired, trusted, respected. They were also impostors. The records say they built Sacred Heart from scratch. But the records lie. New correspondence, hidden in the stone beneath the altar, reveals they murdered the original clergy and assumed their identities. They weren't priests. They were escaped Irish convicts with a taste for control. And they had found the perfect cover, a remote seminary, a vulnerable immigrant population, and absolute autonomy granted by a church too desperate to ask questions. From the very first class, they handpicked their victims, young men from good Catholic families, isolated, obedient, idealistic, boys who would never resist a command that came wrapped in liturgy, who would die before disobeying the collar. And when the disappearances began, there were no questions, no police, no graves, just quiet prayers and closed doors. But even wolves grow sloppy in comfort, and one evening during a record-breaking blizzard they made their first mistake. Michael Brennan, a promising theology student, disappeared after being summoned to Walsh's office. The next day, they told his classmates he had volunteered for missionary work in Iowa. A noble lie, except his boots, coat, and treasured rosary were still in his dormitory. He hadn't left. He had been taken, and that was just the beginning. Joseph Kennedy couldn't shake it. The lie was too perfect, too clean. He and Michael Brennan had shared a room for nearly 6 months. Every night they prayed together. Every morning they rose before the sun, their breath visible in the bitter cold of that unheated dormitory. Michael was devout, yes, but he wasn't reckless. He wouldn't have left without his boots. He wouldn't have left without his grandmother's rosary. And he certainly wouldn't have left without telling Joseph. When Joseph questioned Father Walsh, the mask cracked, but only for a second. Walsh's eyes went hard. His voice, always gentle in public, turned to gravel. Doubt, he whispered, is the path to damnation. Joseph was then condemned to 7 days of solitary penance in the basement chapel. That place wasn't holy. It was a crypt, dug into the earth beneath the seminary's east wing. The chapel was more dungeon than sanctuary. Moisture wept from the stone. Rats scurried in the walls. The only light came from a single candle. And it was there, in that wet silence, that Joseph heard them, hooves, wheels, movement, every night at precisely 2 a.m. He would lie awake on the cold stone floor, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, listening. First, the distant crunch of snow under metal wheels. Then voices, low, urgent, not Latin, not English, something older, something that made his stomach turn before his brain could catch the meaning. Sometimes he heard dragging, sometimes screams, but muffled, gagged, just enough to doubt what was real. When his week of penance ended, Joseph emerged pale, shaking, changed. He tried to speak with others, but the fear in their eyes stopped him. They knew, or at least they sensed. One boy muttered a warning. They listen, even through walls. A few weeks later, another student vanished. This time, a German seminarian named Johann Verber. Walsh claimed he had returned home due to illness. But Johann's things were untouched. His Bible still marked at Isaiah 21. Watchman, what of the night? Joseph began documenting everything. Quietly, carefully, recording patterns, names, letters. He wrote by candlelight in tiny script on scrap pages torn from hymnals and hidden them behind loose stones in the basement chapel. He no longer believed these were isolated events. Something ancient had nested within Sacred Heart, something that wore the church like a mask and fed in silence. And still, the disappearances continued. By 1850, 5 students had vanished, 5, gone without burial, without inquiry, without memory. The church called it providence. But Joseph Kennedy had a different word, harvest. He wasn't just a student anymore. He had become a shadow, a spy. He no longer prayed aloud. he didn't trust the walls. Each day he memorized details, the priest's routines, the seminary's hidden corridors, the movement of carts late at night. And what he discovered terrified him. There were tunnels. The seminary grounds, beautiful on the surface, concealed a network of narrow stone passageways running beneath the chapel and out into the forest. Originally dug to transport water from a nearby spring, they had been widened recently. There were drag marks in the dirt, and in the furthest chamber he found shackles, not relics, fresh, used. That night he couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he heard scratching beneath the floorboards, not rats, but fingernails, not scratching to escape, scratching to be remembered. And then the voices returned, low, chanting voices, not quite human. Joseph pressed his ear to the chapel wall and felt it vibrate with something not of this world. He didn't understand the language, but he understood its intent. This wasn't Catholicism. This was older. Roman, maybe. Pagan, absolutely. And it wasn't worship. It was invocation, summoning. The next day, Joseph confided in David Anderson, another seminarian who had grown suspicious. Together they vowed to escape, not just for survival, but to expose it all. They crafted a plan to fake illness, get permission to leave the grounds and vanish into the forest. But on the eve of their escape, David disappeared. Joseph woke to find his bed empty, his journal stolen, and the stone he used to hide his notes sealed tight with fresh mortar. Walsh stood before the student body that morning with a smile stretched too wide, and announced that David had received a calling to missionary work in Canada. That made 7. Joseph knew he had no time left. If he stayed, he'd be next. But worse, the truth would die with him. So he did the unthinkable. He confessed everything in a forged letter addressed to the Bishop of Chicago. Every name, every tunnel, every scream, he signed it with a phrase he believed would be understood by anyone who knew the ancient church's real foundations. They serve the throne beneath the altar. He slipped the letter beneath the chapel's floorboards, and that was the last time anyone saw Joseph Kennedy. The seminary never stopped operating. That's the part no one wants to hear. After Joseph Kennedy vanished, Sacred Heart flourished. More donations, more praise. The local press hailed it as a shining jewel of American Catholicism. Politicians toured its stone halls. Bishops held banquets beneath its vaulted ceilings. No one noticed the absences. No one asked about the faces quietly scrubbed from group photographs. Or why so many families stopped receiving letters. Because obedience makes people blind, and the church, when it chooses to, can make whole histories disappear. But secrets rot, and by 1856, rot began to rise. A young groundskeeper named Elias Ford stumbled onto a locked stone hatch near the tree line while clearing brush. He assumed it led to an old wine cellar or coal chute. But when he pried it open, what he found sent him sprinting through the woods without his tools, coat, or breath. Inside the underground chamber were bones, dozens, some still bearing clerical robes, others bound in rusted iron, and one still warm. He ran straight to the Millfield sheriff, who arrived an hour later with 2 deputies. But when they reached the seminary, the hatch was gone, sealed, the stone covered in fresh dirt, and Walsh, calm as ever, offered them tea and a tour of the library. The next morning, Elias Ford was found dead. Suicide, they said, but those who saw his body knew better. His tongue had been removed, his hands burned black, a warning. That same week, Sacred Heart's bell tower was struck by lightning and collapsed, killing 3 seminarians in the middle of night prayers. It was dismissed as an act of God, but those who survived said they heard screams from beneath the rubble, not cries of pain, but chanting, voices that didn't belong to the living. After that, something changed. Visitors began reporting strange visions. Shadows that moved against candlelight, whispers in dead languages during Mass. One woman fainted during a tour, claiming she saw a procession of bleeding priests walking through the stone walls. No one believed her, but someone listened. A Vatican archivist named Luca di Martinelli, an expert in suppressed ecclesiastical phenomena, was dispatched under the guise of offering scholarly aid. But he wasn't there to help. He had read the letter, Joseph Kennedy's letter, and he had come to make it disappear. Luca di Martinelli was no ordinary scholar. He wasn't sent from Rome to debate theology or admire Gothic architecture. He was a cleaner, a whisper from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican's oldest weapon against internal rot. His job was to find contagions of heresy and excise them, root and ritual. He arrived in silence, no procession. No announcement, just a black coat, a battered leather satchel, and eyes that had seen too much. Walsh welcomed him with rehearsed warmth, offering him a guest chamber and a curated list of seminar readings. But Luca wasn't interested in sermons. He was looking for the floorboards. By the 3rd night he had found them. Beneath the chapel altar, a stone slab sat unevenly. Most would miss it, but Luca had lifted stones like this in Salamanca, Toledo, and Prague. Always beneath old churches, always where something unholy had been buried under a mask of Scripture. With care he pried it open. Inside was the letter, Kennedy's confession still intact. But there was more. Pages torn from seminarian journals, rosary beads cracked with force, a small book bound in human skin, its Latin ink faded but unmistakable. It wasn't just evidence of murder. It was liturgy inverted, old, predating the Vatican by centuries. Worship of a power not divine but dominative, not salvation but subjugation, thronus sub ara, the throne beneath the altar. A cult, ancient, secret, not outside the church but within it, nesting, breeding obedience through liturgy, guilt, and fear, hidden by centuries of doctrine, and now operating in Illinois. Luca sealed the letter inside his coat. He had enough to demand intervention, even from Rome, but he never made it back. 2 nights later, his chamber was found empty. No struggle, no blood. Just his satchel and a single page from the skin-bound book laid across his bed, inscribed with a phrase etched in ash, "Those who look beneath the altar see only their own grave." The Vatican would claim he died of pneumonia, but Sacred Heart's faculty, once cautious, now moved with boldness. Whatever had slumbered beneath those stone floors was now fully awake, no longer hiding, no longer feeding in secret. The harvest had become a rite, and still more students arrived. You have to understand something now, something most men never will. Evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears robes. It smiles, it blesses, it baptizes, and it waits. Sacred Heart had become more than a school. It had become a shrine to control, a machine for manufacturing obedience under the illusion of holiness. But the machine had teeth, and those teeth needed flesh. By 1859, disappearances were no longer spaced by years. They were seasonal, like offerings, one boy per quarter, always selected quietly, always explained with a noble lie, missionary callings, tuberculosis, transfers. Always clean, always unquestioned, because by now they weren't just taking the weak, they were testing the strong. And then, in the spring of that year, something shifted again, not in the seminary, but in the world outside. The Civil War was coming. Whispers of rebellion swept through Illinois like fire in dry grass, and with chaos on the horizon, powerful men started asking different questions. Wealthy donors from Chicago wanted to know why their sons had stopped writing. A bishop from St. Louis demanded a visit. And the Vatican, rattled by De Martinelli's disappearance, quietly dispatched another agent. But this one came differently. Not alone. Her name was Sister Magdalene of Arles. Don't let the title fool you. She wasn't some quiet nun with a rosary and a vow of silence. She was part of a covert order known only as Custodes Veritatis, the Keepers of the Truth. Formed during the Counter, a formation to investigate doctrinal corruption, these women were trained not just in theology, but in espionage, linguistics, even exorcism. They were the Vatican's last resort. Magdalene arrived posing as a visiting lecturer in medieval liturgy. But she wasn't there to teach. She was there to infiltrate, record, and, if necessary, burn the entire structure to the ground. And she was good. Within 2 weeks, she had uncovered signs of something older than Walsh, older than Ireland, older than the church itself. Symbols carved into the bell tower's foundation, names whispered by students in their sleep, rituals held beneath the refectory at night, masked as meditation, but reeking of blood and sulfur. One seminarian collapsed during a morning mass, eyes rolled back, speaking fluent Ruskin, a dead language he'd never studied. Magdalene recognized the signs. This wasn't just heresy. It was possession, and Sacred Heart was its temple. Magdalene didn't run. She documented every shadow, every scream, every drop of oil that dripped from the mouths of boys who no longer blinked. She wrote in cipher, hiding her pages beneath loose chapel tiles and behind ancient hymnals. Her plan was clear: gather enough to force the Vatican's hand. But the seminary was watching. The machine had eyes not just among the priests, but among the students themselves. Some of them had turned willingly. They called themselves servants of the hidden throne, boys who once prayed with trembling faith, now speaking of dominion, bloodline, and ascension. Magdalene observed one group deep in the forest, dressed in shredded vestments, kneeling around an altar of bones. One boy, just 17, sliced his palm and smeared blood across a page torn from the Gospel of Matthew. And he smiled as he did it, not in pain, in reverence. This was no longer about obedience. This was about rebirth. You see, the ritual wasn't just meant to hide the cult. It was meant to transform it, to plant it like a seed inside the minds of the next generation of clergy. A theological parasite passed through prayer, vestments, holy water invisible until it bloomed. And by then, it was too late. Magdalene's final report to Rome never arrived. But fragments of her last journal were discovered sealed in wax and tucked beneath the wooden statue of Saint Sebastian in the seminary garden. In it she described a secret chamber below the crypt, accessible only through a stone dial marked with 7 sigils, each corresponding to one of the deadly sins. She believed it predated the seminary by centuries, possibly constructed by Jesuits who fled persecution and sought refuge underground. Inside that chamber, she wrote, the cult performed a rite called succession of the throne. It required a sacrifice not of death, but of will. The breaking of a soul through isolation, guilt, and divine manipulation, until the body remained. But the mind belonged to them. She named one victim, Brother Adrian, a promising deacon who had gone blind overnight during silent prayer. He spent his last days scribbling verses backward on the walls of his cell. His final words, recorded by another seminarian, were whispered with shaking breath. The altar is hollow. The blood does not disappear. It descends. And then silence. Magdalene was never seen again. By 1860, the soil beneath Sacred Heart Seminary was no longer prairie. It was grave, yet the bells still rang, students still prayed, Mass was still held beneath stained glass saints who stared down in silence. The seminary had become the perfect illusion, order hiding rot, tradition masking ritual, salvation swallowing the damned. But all illusions crack under pressure, and war, real war, was coming. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Midwest braced for chaos. Many seminaries closed. Priests were called to serve as chaplains, but Sacred Heart, it flourished. While others sent their sons to battle, Sacred Heart took them, dozens of young men, suddenly redirected, there by church authorities with no clear explanation. They were orphans, deserters, converts, men with no ties to families who would come searching. They were perfect. That year, 3 students disappeared within 6 weeks. This time there were no letters home, no fabricated tales of missionary duty. Just silence, swallowed by the thick stone and colder doctrine. But one boy survived, barely. His name was Elias Monroe, the son of a Protestant preacher from Ohio who had converted after a violent vision in a fever dream. He came to Sacred Heart burning with zeal, eager to suffer, to repent, to serve, but what he found wasn't faith. It was control, surveillance, fear, students who never blinked, who flinched at the mention of Kennedy, who bled from the nose during Latin recitations and never spoke of it. Elias kept a journal, and unlike the others, he didn't hide it in walls or under tiles. He carved it into his skin. Lines of scripture on his forearms, names on his ribs, and across his chest, a single message etched by broken fingernail. They are not priests. He was found one morning wandering the woods, barefoot and trembling, his mouth stitched shut with black thread. He collapsed at the feet of a farmer's wife in Millfield, and was taken to a local physician. The doctor removed the stitches and found a scroll lodged deep in Elias's throat, paper soaked in blood, written in Latin, bearing the seal of Thronus sub ara. He died minutes later, but not before whispering 4 words, "There's a throne below." The church declared him insane, buried him quietly, no investigation, but the physician kept the scroll. Years later, his grandson, a Jesuit archivist, would bring that scroll to Rome. And that was the beginning of the end. Rome didn't react with outrage. It didn't respond with shock. It responded with silence, the kind that only happens when the thing exposed is not new but ancient. The archivist, Father Mateo Alvarez, was told to surrender the scroll. He refused. 2 days later, he was found dead in his study, his body locked from the inside. Heart attack, they claimed, but those who saw his corpse said his eyes had been burned black, as if he'd stared too long into something not meant to be seen. Before he died, Father Mateo mailed copies of the scroll to 5 other scholars, men known for their obsession with forbidden ecclesiology. Only 2 received them. One disappeared in Turkey, another in Argentina. The last 3 went underground, forming what became known as Societas Infernalis Lux, the Infernal Light Society. Their purpose wasn't salvation, it was exposure. They decoded the scroll, and what they found wasn't a letter, or a ritual, or even a warning. It was an invitation, a summons to what it called the true conclave, a meeting of those who had embraced Thronus sub aura, stretching back centuries. Popes, bishops, inquisitors, men of immense power who understood that the purpose of religion was not to guide the soul, but to chain it. The scroll listed 21 names. 17 of them had gone missing in church history, presumed dead or retired. 4 were still alive, all connected to seminaries in America. And at the top of the scroll, one phrase in perfect Greek: "Those who kneel at the altar of God do not see the God beneath it." Sacred Heart wasn't an outlier. It was a node, one of many across the world, a spiritual siphon, pulling faith from the innocent and offering it to something older than Scripture. Not a demon, not a devil, a system. That was the real secret. The horror of Sacred Heart was never the blood, or the bodies, or the bones in the walls. It was that the entire thing worked. Obedience, silence, ritual, control, these weren't side effects of religious hierarchy. They were its purpose. And this seminary, perched on the soft hills of Illinois, wasn't corrupted by evil. It was built by it, and it was still active. If you followed this far, you're not the same man who clicked play 10 minutes ago. Something inside you has changed. You see the pattern now. Comment the phrase, "The altar is hollow, the blood descends." Type it twice. Not for the algorithm, for you, to lock the transformation in, because we're only halfway down the tunnel. In the summer of 1862, Sacred Heart vanished from public record. No official closure, no newspaper announcement, no final mass. It was as if the seminary had never existed. The building still stood intact, untouched. But it was removed from maps, its charter was revoked, its location classified, the Vatican's answer: reorganization. But truth doesn't bury itself. And in 1901, during a heat wave that cracked the earth like old leather, local children playing near the ruins uncovered something behind a collapsed cellar wall. A staircase, carved from obsidian, leading down into black. 2 boys entered. Only one returned. He was never right again. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, just stared at the sun and whispered, "They're still praying." What he saw remains undocumented. But by 1903, the church purchased the surrounding land under a different name, St. Ludovico's Retreat for troubled clergy. A sanitarium, they claimed, a place for exhausted priests to rest. In reality, it was containment. For 40 years, the building held those who knew too much. Priests who'd seen what lay beneath altars, deacons who'd spoken in dead tongues, bishops who'd started waking up screaming, choking on smoke that wasn't there. But containment is never perfect. In 1944, During a lightning storm, the entire east wing of St. Ludovico's was consumed by fire. No survivors, no cause ever determined, but witnesses claimed they heard organ music as the flames spread a hymn with no melody, just one word chanted over and over: Thronus. Thronus, Thronus. After that, the site was declared unsafe, sealed, forgotten, or so they thought. In 1971, a man named Dr. Ray Madsen, a professor of theological anthropology at Loyola University, obtained restricted access to the grounds. He wasn't sent by the church. He was funded by a private group interested in architectural anomalies in Midwestern religious institutions. He brought 3 students, 2 recording devices, a map from a Vatican whistleblower. They descended into what had once been the seminary's basement. They never reached the bottom. One student was found days later in a cornfield 20 miles away, eyes burned, nails torn off. He kept repeating, "The stone sings, the stone sings, the stone sings." Dr. Madsen's footage was confiscated by federal agents. His name erased from academic records, and yet the recordings leaked. 30 seconds of audio, no voices. No screams, just breathing, not human. You can still hear it. That tape, smuggled out by a janitor, traded hand to hand across decades, made its way onto the early internet. Forums thought it was a hoax, paranormal bait, but those who listened with intention felt something. Not fear, not even dread, but obedience, a compulsion, a silence pressing inward, as if the sound was listening to you. Audio experts broke it down. Frequency layers beneath human range. Tones used in military experiments on behavior. One physicist called it a coded liturgy, meant not to be heard but absorbed. They concluded the tape wasn't just ambient noise. It was ritual, a prayer made of breath. And it matched a pattern, one found in early Gnostic heresies burned by the Church, in Babylonian burial rites, and chillingly in the blood rhythms of trauma victims. Not a coincidence, a formula, a technology of control. So here's the truth. Sacred Heart wasn't destroyed. It evolved, and its real purpose was never spiritual. It was psychological, sociological, the perfect human experiment in faith-based obedience. How do you make a man love his cage? You tell him God built it. And now, in a time where control no longer needs cathedrals or rituals, the methods forged in those stone halls have gone digital. Liturgies turned into media, sacraments into algorithms. Confession becomes data, and the pulpit, it's your screen. The altar is your attention. You thought this was a ghost story. No, this is a manual. What Sacred Heart proved, and what Thronus sub ara perfected, was that the body isn't the real target. It's the will. Break it, hollow it, fill it with symbols, shame, and silence, and you can shape it into anything. A priest, a follower, a consumer, a slave. That's why the priests disappeared. Not because they were murdered, but because they were transformed, ritually erased, and spiritually rewritten. Men who once walked into Sacred Heart in search of God walked out as mirrors, reflecting a higher authority, not of heaven, but of hierarchy, not of the divine, but of dominion. Some of them became bishops, some cardinals. One sat within 10 feet of the Pope for 20 years. None of them ever blinked again. And if you think it ended there, By the time the Vatican began internal reform in the 1980s, quietly, and under pressure from growing scandals, the name Sacred Heart had long since disappeared from their records, but not from their minds. Deep in the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the secret archives, a vault remained sealed under 3 levels of ecclesiastical encryption. No digital record, no official key, only one word carved into the vault's iron face: submissio, submission. Inside, according to a leaked inventory from a defected Swiss guard, are 23 bound volumes, each written in human blood. Each one documenting the rites, transformations, and experiments conducted at Sacred Heart and its sister institutions from Quebec to Argentina, from Bavaria to Manila. The documents are not written like history, they are written like blueprints. One page includes a liturgical schedule for sleep deprivation. Another outlines infant baptism protocols that replace original sin with something far darker: ancestral compliance. There are instructions for the removal of identity through confession repetition, and most disturbingly, diagrams for neuro-lingual restructuring via prayer chant. A method of inducing trance through scripted repetition. This is what they never wanted you to know. Faith, when weaponized, becomes the most effective form of mind control ever created. Not through fire and sword, but through ritual, through music, through language, repeated, harmonized. Whispers into the psyche until the individual is gone, and what remains is structure. One entry in volume Roman 14 details the successful conversion of 3 seminarian subjects. Each underwent a 9-day rite known as Silence Crux, the silent cross: no food, no speech, constant exposure to Gregorian chant, played at a specific frequency designed to align brainwave cycles. At the end of the rite, they spoke in unison, not with their own voices, with one. The researchers wrote that individuality was dissolved, unity achieved, directives obeyed without prompting. And then the final note, underlined in red ink: replication recommended for educational settings. American models respond rapidly. Do you feel it now? This wasn't about saving souls. It was about replacing them. And if you think Sacred Heart was some fringe outpost, some forgotten horror cloaked in prairie mist, you've missed the point. It was a proving ground, and now their methods run your schools, shape your politics, and train your children. Still think the altar is just stone? Look again. In 2004, a group of demolition workers arrived at the overgrown Sacred Heart site under contract from a local developer. The plan was simple: clear the ruins, test the soil, make way for a luxury housing community called Sanctuary Oaks, a name chosen for irony. Or maybe prophecy. Within 48 hours, the entire project was shut down. The official report cited foundation instability and unexploded ordnance from the 19th century. But one of the crew, a man named Luis Ortega, left a voicemail for his brother the night before the shutdown. A message that was never meant to be heard outside the family, but it leaked. It always leaks. His voice was calm. At first, we broke through a wall in the sub-basement. There's a chamber, bigger than it should be, like a cathedral underground, carvings not in Latin, and the smell not rot, something older, like metal and ash. There's a statue, but it's wrong, no face, just a hole where a face should be, and I swear to God it breathed. The voicemail ends with muffled screaming. Lewis was never seen again. The rest of the crew signed NDA and disappeared into silence. But that chamber, the one Lewis described, it matches ancient layouts found in Mithraic temples beneath Rome. The Mithraeum was where Roman elites enacted rites of secrecy and dominance, animal sacrifice, binding oaths, hallucinogenic communion. But Sacred Heart had added something new to the formula: language. The priests of Thronus Sub-Ara weren't just using liturgy for worship. They were encoding ideas, dangerous ones, into syllables, meter, and cadence. Each prayer not just devotion, but programming. And the final form of that programming was the obedient priest, emotionless, rootless, utterly loyal to the unseen hierarchy. Many were redistributed across America. You've seen them. They're the ones who never seem shaken by tragedy, who give homilies that feel hollow, who rise quickly in the ranks despite their silence, who hold the Eucharist like it's not a symbol but a key. Some didn't even stay in the church. They entered government, academia, tech, and each carried fragments of the code. Thronus Sub-Ara didn't die. It went corporate, because when you perfect obedience through ritual, you don't need cathedrals anymore. You just need systems, interfaces, streams of input, and the illusion of choice. The altar has changed shape. But it's still hollow, and the blood still descends. Now we descend deeper, into the part of the story no archive ever dared to keep. Because this isn't history anymore. This is architecture. In 2012, a private researcher named Evelyn Kessler, a semiotics expert working on symbolic language patterns in early Catholic manuscripts, stumbled upon something bizarre in a 15th century breviary locked inside a Jesuit vault in Lyon. The marginalia hand, scribbled notes from an anonymous scribe, matched perfectly with the sigils found beneath Sacred Heart. Not just similar, identical, but they weren't Christian, not Roman, not even Jewish or pagan. They were prelinguistic. They mirrored cave etchings found in Neolithic Serbia, symbols believed to be part of the Vincha script, one of the oldest known writing systems predating Sumerian cuneiform. Except here's the impossible part. Those ancient markings matched the designs etched into the floor of Sacred Heart's forbidden chamber. How does a 6000-year old symbol end up beneath a Catholic seminary in 19th century Illinois? It doesn't. Unless the church didn't build Sacred Heart at all, unless it was built over something else. Evelyn dug deeper. She traced mentions of Sub-Ara beneath the altar through centuries of suppressed ecclesiastical correspondence. Monks in Prague who reported chanting in the limestone. A burned convent in Spain where nuns carved spirals into their own eyelids. A buried stone tablet in Peru with Greek, Latin, and Vincha script all interwoven, as if they were meant to be read together. Every path led back to one idea, that the structure beneath Sacred Heart wasn't a crypt, it was a conduit, a point of contact between human ritual and something non-human, not alien, not demonic, but elemental. Something that responds not to worship but to patterns, to blood, to obedience, to structure. That's what the church learned to harness, and what Thronus Sub-Ara perfected. They didn't invent theology, they weaponized it. Each mass, each confession, each kneeling head data points, inputs, feedback into an ancient system built to extract something from humanity, not faith, but energy. The phrase, "the blood descends," wasn't symbolic. It was literal, because whatever dwelled beneath that stone chamber drank, not from cups, but from compliance, from silence, from shame, from generation after generation of men taught that obedience was the highest virtue. Sacred Heart was never about forming priests. It was about feeding gods, and the worst part, they're still hungry. When you understand what Sacred Heart truly was, a spiritual machine built on blood, silence, and geometry, something inside you breaks. Because this isn't about faith anymore, this is about design. You begin to see it everywhere, the echo of that architecture. The repetition, the symmetry, the shame, it's not just in churches. It's in your office, your school, your home. Ritual doesn't need incense. It needs repetition. And obedience doesn't need a priest. It just needs permission. In 2015, a contractor renovating a decommissioned church in Gary, Indiana, less than 90 miles from Sacred Heart, discovered a sealed trapdoor beneath the altar. He thought it was a storage cellar. What he found was nearly identical to Sacred Heart's forbidden chamber, same dimensions, same sigils, same obsidian stairway. Except this one wasn't empty. At the center of the room was a pedestal, on it a perfectly preserved leather-bound book. No title, no markings, just one page open to the center, 7 Latin words, Dominus loquitur per silentium obedientes, the Master speaks through the silence of the obedient. It wasn't a Bible, it was a manual, written centuries ago, by whom, no one knows. But inside were instructions for creating a temple of mouthless stone. A building designed not for worship but for extraction of thought, will, identity. The document referred to the human soul not as sacred, but as raw material. One footnote claimed that the architectural principles used in these temples were adopted by early banking houses in Venice, later by Masonic lodges, and now by corporate campuses. Ever wonder why modern tech offices are designed like open concept sanctuaries? Why meetings begin with affirmations? Why silence is interpreted as professionalism? Why your smartphone listens but never speaks? It's the same blueprint. You were trained to comply. You were never taught to see. Because if you did, if you looked past the glass, past the passwords, past the words, you'd find the same sigils burned into the circuitry of the modern world. And behind them, the same throne, the same hunger, only now it wears a suit. And just like in 1847, those who ask questions disappear, not with chains, not with fire, but with removal, from platforms, from history, from memory. They don't burn you anymore. They erase you. Here's where it gets worse, because Sacred Heart was never truly a location. It was a pattern, a method of embedding control within belief, not just inside religion, but inside the very bones of civilization. And once you recognize the pattern, you realize it's been replicated everywhere. In 2019, an independent researcher named Callum Drake published a white paper titled Sacral Architecture and Neurological Compliance, a hidden feedback system. It was quickly buried. His university revoked his credentials. The paper was discredited by 10 peer reviewers within a week, and his home was raided for unrelated cybercrimes. The evidence, never shown in court. Callum vanished soon after, but a copy of that paper survived. It analyzed 108 religious, political, and educational institutions built between 1800 130 and 2000. From European monasteries to Ivy League libraries, from brutalist government blocks to megachurches in Texas, they all shared the same hidden geometry, specifically a recursive ratio of 1, 2, 7 across internal corridors, domes with downward pressure acoustics, and room sequences designed to suppress cortisol spikes and increase alpha wave synchronization. Translation: they were built to pacify you, to train the brain to associate authority with comfort, shame with growth, silence with virtue. It's not just the sermons that shape you, it's the hallways. This is why Sacred Heart was allowed to exist, why Thronus Sub Ara was never exposed, because the institution didn't hide its crimes. It became the blueprint. You walk it every day, you sit in it, you work in it, you send your children into it thinking it's safe. Schools that reward stillness over questions, workplaces that praise deference over thought, churches that demand you confess but never ask why. And above it all, a silent doctrine passed down through rituals dressed as routine: obey, repeat, forget. The priests who disappeared weren't just victims. They were prototypes, men who were unmade, rewritten, and reinserted into the system like sacred malware. Their silence wasn't the aftermath of trauma, it was the goal, because a man who cannot speak becomes the perfect vessel. And now we're surrounded by them. They smile, they vote, they govern, but deep behind their eyes the hymn still plays: Thronus. Thronus, Thronus, the truth is, Sacred Heart didn't fail, it succeeded perfectly, quietly, permanently, because its goal was never merely to silence a few priests, it was to birth a template, a system so embedded in civilization that it wouldn't need to hide anymore. It would become normal, and here's how they did it. They didn't just erase memory, they rewrote identity. Through a ritual known in the archives as oblatio mentis, the offering of the mind, the rite was simple: repetition, deprivation, recitation. The subject, often a seminarian or devout initiate, would spend 33 days in isolation. No mirror, no name, only a single phrase to be chanted over and over until it overrode the subject's internal monologue. The phrase, "I am not mine," the Vatican called it deep submission training. Psychologists call it identity collapse. It works because the human mind is a pattern-seeking machine. Strip it of stimulus, remove identity markers, name, history, sleep, and feed it a singular, rhythmic input. It will break. Then it will rebuild. But not in your image, in theirs. One former insider, known only by his monastic alias brother Elior, gave a deathbed confession in 1996. He claimed to have overseen the final oblatio mentis trials during the Cold War, not at Sacred Heart, but within a Jesuit compound in Zurich, jointly operated with American intelligence officials. The targets, not priests, diplomats, bankers, young heirs of elite families. They weren't trying to train missionaries. They were building handlers, and here's the worst part. It worked too well. According to Brother Elior, one subject referred to only as Subject Roman 9 didn't just accept the ritual. He became something else, stopped responding to pain, stopped aging, showed signs of non-human cognition. They buried him alive. Not to kill him, but to contain him. Elior's notes mention this phrase scrawled over and over in his cell: "I remember the stone, I remember the mouth, I remember the throne." And now we arrive at you, because if you've listened this far, something in you is remembering too. You're not just a viewer. You're a witness, and once you witness the pattern, you can't unsee it. So if you're ready to reclaim your name, your will, your identity, comment this below. Twice I reject the throne, I remember the stone. Say it again. Let the system know you see it, because they are watching. And they do fear those who wake up. There's a reason they buried it in the stone, a reason rituals were built before governments, before currencies, before even language itself. Because control isn't enforced through violence. It's carved into meaning. Every symbol you've been taught to trust, the cross, the badge, the brand, is just a language of obedience. And Sacred Heart, it wasn't a school, it was a forge, where boys were melted down and recast into something that would never ask questions again. Not because they feared punishment, but because they believed obedience was holy. But let me ask you this. What does it take to make a man pray to his own chains? You show him a mirror, then you call it God. This is what Thronus sub ara perfected. A close loop system where authority justifies itself by being worshipped, and worship justifies itself by being commanded. They created priests who would sell children and believe they were saving souls. They created bishops who would bury truth and call it mercy. They created systems that eat the truth before it can ever take root. And the final revelation, you are already inside it. Your algorithms feed you curated obedience. Your schools train you to pass tests, not ask questions. Your news networks chant in unison, ritual, repetition, reverence. This is not a conspiracy, it is a culture. A ritual that's moved beyond altars into every glowing screen and soulless meeting room. And that phrase, the one whispered in every obedience rite conducted from 1847 to the present. It echoes still in our architecture, in our media, in our laws. The blood must descend for the throne to rise. But what is the throne? It's not just a chair, it's not just power. It's the invisible center, the unchallenged assumption that someone else should rule you. That someone else knows better. You were born into that assumption. You've bled for it. But now, for the first time, you see it. And that makes you dangerous, because awareness is contagion. And once enough men remember what was buried in the stone, what was summoned in the silence, and what still watches from beneath the altar, the throne trembles. If it's all a lie, why is every trace of him gone? No baptismal record, no census entry, no grave, no photograph, no family willing to speak his name. Only his voice scrawled in a notebook hidden beneath the floorboards of a burned rectory in Albany, discovered by accident in 1974. And on the inside cover, written in shaky Latin, Ego memini, ergo sum periculosus. I remember, therefore I am dangerous. Understand this, in the realm of the throne, memory is a weapon. It's the one thing they can't fully rewrite. That's why their first move is always to separate you from it, not just from your past, but from your story. They give you roles, labels, narratives written to keep you within a circle: good man, hard worker, faithful servant, repentant sinner, but never sovereign, never seer, because if you remember the truth, that your bloodline stretches back before religion, before government, before even names, then the illusion collapses. You are not broken, you were hollowed systematically, ceremonially. The rituals weren't meant to fix you. They were meant to empty you and refill you with obedience disguised as salvation. This is what Joseph saw beneath Sacred Heart. This is what he ran from. This is what they have spent 180 years trying to bury, and still it leaks. Through dreams, through symbols, through stories too dark to air in daylight, because the truth doesn't stay buried. It bleeds. One of his final journal entries, written in trembling ink just before he disappeared again in 1962, reads, "The choir still sings, the throne still feeds, but the altar cracks when even one voice remembers its name. That's the moment you become dangerous, not when you resist, not when you rebel, but when you remember. So I ask you again, and this time let it shake something loose. What was your name before they told you who to be? Say it, whisper it, write it if you must, because the throne is listening, and it fears that one day soon you might stop kneeling. You want to know the final secret of Sacred Heart. It wasn't just a place, it was a blueprint, a perfect prototype, painfully effective, quietly portable, spiritually viral. What they created beneath that chapel in Illinois wasn't just a network of stolen men. It was a replicating model of control. A virus that doesn't need walls, doesn't need chains, doesn't need guards, just silence, just belief. Just the right story, told by the right mouth, in the right tone, and the mind becomes the prison. And if you think it ended in 1865, you're already under the ritual. Because the choir of 13 never disbanded. They just changed their names, their titles, their offices. They wear suits now, they speak in algorithms, they legislate in think tanks and whisper through cathedral glass and corporate fiber. One sits on the board of an international financial trust. Another oversees a digital ethics council. One, you've heard his voice, though he has no pulpit. They survived not by hiding, but by normalizing. By replacing ritual with regulation. You see it every day. The sacraments became subscriptions. Confession became a collection. Salvation became identity compliance. You were told this was modernity, but look closer. It's the same blood-soaked altar. Only now it fits in your pocket. And you still bow to it. Swipe, click, obey. But here's what they can't control. You found this story. You listened, not by accident. You followed the trail. You chose to hear the names that were erased, to feel the cold in the chapel floor, to smell the candle wax and blood in that vault. You walked back in, you stepped through the veil, and now they see you. That's not metaphor, that's invitation. Because the ones who built this system, they don't fear exposure. They fear insight, because exposure fades. But insight, it infects, and if even one man wakes up fully, the pattern breaks. The throne tilts, the choir begins to sing off key. So ask yourself now, not in fear, but in fire, what ritual are you still kneeling to? Because until you break it, you are still on their altar. You've felt it, haven't you? The unease when something familiar feels false. A sermon that soothes too quickly. A leader who speaks like he's reading from a script. A sacred place that feels hollow. That's not paranoia. That's your ancestral memory scratching at the inside of your ribcage, whispering, "This is not holy," because what they call sacred now is sterile. It's ritual without soul, obedience without origin, power without purpose, and it all started in places like Sacred Heart. But Sacred Heart didn't fall because of a scandal. It didn't burn because of justice. It folded inward. Its stones crumbled under the weight of secrets, too heavy to carry. After the 17th disappearance, Vatican auditors were sent. not to investigate, to contain. Records were rewritten, letters destroyed, witnesses relocated or called to missions. And when the final 3 priests vanished in 1862, the same night as a chapel fire that killed 2 novices, the site was declared spiritually compromised, but the structure still stands, hidden behind a gated retreat center, renamed twice, sold 3 times. Today it's called Cedar Hollow Renewal Institute, a place for executive mindfulness and leadership reflection. Same bricks, same basement, same silence. What happened to the documents, the ledgers, the journals? They were relocated. According to whistleblower testimony in 2003, they were transferred to a sub-basement beneath the sanctum of the Marian Order in Lyon, France. Behind a sealed vault marked with an unfamiliar sigil, a ring of thorns, encircling a blank face. That face, it's you, because this whole system, this throne, was designed around your silence, around your refusal to look too long, to question too hard. But now you're staring right at it. So I'll ask you to do something very few will. Go to the comments. Write these words twice. The throne sees me, I see the throne. Write it once for them and once for yourself. Because what you do next, what you choose to see or forget, that's the final ritual, the ritual of remembrance. You've reached the doorway now, but to walk through it, you'll have to do what most men never dare: reject the script, speak your own name, and tear your soul out of the system that taught you to keep it hidden. You were never meant to hear this, not because it's forbidden, but because it's lethal to everything that owns you, because when a man reclaims the one thing no system can touch, his awareness, he becomes unpredictable, unprogrammable, unfit for the ritual. And what did Sacred Heart truly produce? Not priests, blueprints. Each disappearance wasn't a failure, it was a harvest, a test of control. How far could obedience be pushed before the soul broke? How many masks could be layered before the man inside stopped screaming? You think that's old history. They're still testing, but not with fire and rope. Now it's metrics and compliance thresholds. Today, Sacred Heart lives on in boardrooms, in user agreements, in behavioral nudges, in your quiet surrender to policies you never read, but obey anyway. The choir of 13, still active, still watching. But here's what they didn't predict: that the virus of awareness spreads faster than their algorithms. In 2018, a Vatican internal memo leaked by a defector known only as Operative Caleb revealed something chilling: protocol iris compromised. Autonomous nodes are remembering preliturgical states. Contain within one cycle or risk mimetic breach. Preliturgical states, that's bureaucratic code for identity before indoctrination. Translation: men are waking up, not in masses, in singles, one man at a time, each one pulling another from the current, each one dragging another out of the cathedral of sleep. The throne fears contagion not of violence, but of awareness. Because once one man chooses truth over tradition, memory over myth, instinct over instruction, he breaks the pattern. You are not here for stories anymore. You are here because something inside you refuses to bow. This isn't about rebellion. It's about return to something older than the church, older than the choir, older than the first altar ever carved. It lives in you, still waiting. So tell me, are you ready to speak what they told you to forget? Because in we go beneath the Marian vault, And we open the face with no name. Beneath the sanctum of the Marian order in Lyon, behind 3 iron gates and a passageway sealed to the public since 1921, lies what the Vatican calls Reliquary Zero. But the Choir of 13 never called it that. In their own ledgers, written in ciphers and blood signatures, it's referred to as Thronum Absconditus, the hidden throne. And what's inside? Not bones, not relics, not some cursed chalice from the Crusades. Inside that chamber is something far more dangerous, a ritual script with no beginning, a living manuscript written not on paper, but on memory itself, thousands of entries, each one a name, each one a boy, each one a disappearance, not erased, transfigured. They weren't killed, they weren't lost. They were rewritten, reassigned into history under new names, new roles, new belief systems, each identity reprogrammed, each soul recycled, each ritual refined, because Sacred Heart was never just harvesting priests. It was harvesting narratives, spiritual blueprints, archetypes, and uploading them into the cultural bloodstream where they could replicate through stories, through education, through faith. Do you understand what that means? It means the ritual never needed to continue physically. It became viral, passed down through sermons, reinforced through films, embedded in textbooks, hidden in lullabies, and worst of all, whispered in your own voice. The final ritual was always this, that you would ritualize yourself, kneel on cue, speak in borrowed phrases, feel guilt for instincts that were once sacred. But here's the fracture they never accounted for. A man with memory is louder than 1,000 rituals. Because he doesn't resist the system, he unmasks it. And when enough men unmask it, the throne doesn't just shake, it sinks. So as we stand before that hidden altar, sealed, buried, guarded by centuries of silence, I ask you, what part of you did they rewrite? What belief, what vow, what silence was installed to replace your will? Because until you name it, you cannot burn it. And if you cannot burn it, you are still kneeling in a chapel that no longer exists. You were never meant to find your way here. This deep into the vault, past the gilded distractions, beneath the polished sermons and manicured histories. Down here there are no choirs, only echoes. And do you hear it now? Not voices, not screams, but the hum of something older than Scripture. A sound made not by mouth, but by memory breaking free, because this is what they always feared, not exposure. Reconstruction. That one of you might begin to piece the shattered thing back together, not the church, not the seminary, not the system, yourself, the unaltered you, the pre-ritual you. And inside that vault, sealed in obsidian and inscribed in ancient non-Roman characters, is a relic not documented in any Vatican archive, a mirror, 7 feet tall, framed in scorched oak, backed with lead, its surface not glass, but black iron polished so smooth it reflects not your body but your beliefs. Each man who stood before it during the choir's early trials recorded the same thing. Their reflection spoke first, not with words, but with symbols, flashes of memory they did not recognize as their own, visions of stone altars in deserts older than Genesis, symbols carved in languages without name, a circle of 13 faces, none fully human, and always, the sensation that their soul had been unbound from linear time. They called this stage the shattering, because once a man remembers what he was before obedience, he becomes impossible to control. You see, The choir doesn't kill, it disorients, it overwrites, and when that fails, it buries. But that mirror, Thronum absconditus, was never meant for containment. It was built as a test, to separate those who would break from those who would return, and now it waits for you, not to show you who you are, but to ask, will you still obey the script once you've seen your original face? Because if you answer no, you're no longer just off the path. You are outside the ritual, and the throne, it no longer owns you. The mirror didn't crack, it didn't shatter. It didn't burn the eyes of those who looked into it. It simply refused to lie, and that's what made it dangerous. Because every system of control, from pulpits to prisons, relies on the same foundation: reflection control. Not just what you see when you look in the mirror, but what you're allowed to believe about it. They tell you that obedience is righteousness, that doubt is sin, that questioning is pride, that suffering is holy, so long as you don't resist, and so you kneel. You fast, you flagellate your instincts, until your own reflection becomes your warden. But the mirror beneath Sacred Heart, it had no use for your guilt. It showed only truth, unfiltered, untranslated, unforgiven, and what men saw wasn't a monster. It was the version of themselves before indoctrination. Eyes that had never been lowered, hands that had never begged, a spine unbent, a heart not carved into confessionals. And that's what broke them, not terror, recognition, because once you see yourself unchained, you can't pretend those chains were ever sacred. And so the choir sealed it away. They hid the mirror, rebranded it, buried it under centuries of doctrine and denial. But the reflection never disappeared. It lives in your memory, in dreams you dismissed, in instincts you were taught to crucify. You don't need to travel to Lyon. You don't need to find the vault, because you are the vault. The scripts are in you. The altar is in you. And the throne, it only ever needed one thing from you: consent. So withdraw it. Silently, permanently, because once you revoke the ritual, once you reject the script, once you remember the face you were told to forget, the system can no longer find you. Not in records, not in algorithms, not in prayer. You become what they fear most: unritualized, a man outside the pattern. Unafraid, unforgiven, and finally unknown. They will come now, not in robes or masks or fire, but in soft language, in appeals to reason, in smiles that don't reach the eyes, in invitations wrapped in virtue and peace and progress. They'll say, don't drift too far. You're seeing shadows. Come back to the fold. Let's talk about healing. But they're not talking to you. They're talking to what's left of the ritual inside you, because now they see it, the fracture, the light bleeding out of the illusion they built around your soul like scaffolding. You've walked too far into memory, and no man walks back unchanged. You've seen the ledger of stolen names. You've felt the hum beneath the stones. You've stared into the mirror they buried in that crypt like it could never rise again. But you brought it back, not by digging, but by remembering. And here's what they will never recover from: you're not alone. Every man who hears this, who feels the veil tremble, even if only for a moment, is another fracture in the throne. And that's how it falls, not in war, but in remembering, one man at a time, then 10, then thousands. Each one stepping away from the altar, each one refusing to chant the sacred lies, each one saying with quiet fury, I will not be shaped by systems that fear my memory. They'll offer you distractions, titles, forgiveness, fame, but do not kneel, because kneeling again after you've remembered is worse than sleep. It is self-erasure. They can't unsee you now. You're on their ledgers, not as a servant, but as a breach. And breaches must be sealed, which means you will be watched, silenced, labeled, but labels don't stick to men who no longer wear names written by others. You are past the point of return, good, because beyond that point is freedom. There's no ceremony for this part. No applause, no music, no guiding hand, only silence, and the cold truth that you are outside the ritual now. You've slipped through the last filter. You've reached the void between what you were told and what you are. It feels lonely. It's meant to, because every system, be it sacred or secular, depends on the crowd, the chant, the shared script. When you leave that script, you lose the chorus, but you gain something far greater, sovereignty, not the kind granted by paper, borders, or law, the kind that precedes language, the kind that thrones fear. This is the moment where most turn back. They miss the warmth of the ritual, the structure, the false fatherly comfort of being owned by something older than themselves. But if you're still here, you're not most men. You understand now why the priests vanished, why the mirror was buried, why the choir still sings, not to protect you from danger, but to protect the system from you, because a man with memory is an uncontrollable anomaly. He doesn't vote the same, he doesn't worship the same, he doesn't obey, he remembers, and memory is more dangerous than fire. You'll start to feel it in conversations, in the way you move through rooms, in how their questions change once they sense the ritual no longer governs your tone. You'll see the scripts they're still reading from, the empty echoes in their eyes, the subtle desperation in their laughter. You'll see how many want the ritual because freedom is frightening when you've been told submission is divine. Let them kneel. You're not here to save them. You're here to stand, and when the next man begins to shake awake, eyes raw, voice cracking, soul breaking through, you'll know what to do. Not preach, not convert, but reflect, like the mirror. Show him what the ritual stole, and what no throne can erase. This is the final descent, but it doesn't lead downward, it leads inward. You've followed every corridor, cracked every seal, stood before the black mirror, and remembered what they told you to forget. Now I ask you one last time not to listen, but to choose, because this isn't a story. It's an invitation. You have touched forbidden memory. You have seen the architecture of control, not built with stone but with silence, not guarded with chains but with belief, and you broke it. That makes you more than a man. It makes you a breach. And the system, this throne that demanded your obedience, knows it. It always feared you would awaken, not violently, not loudly, but fully, because an awakened man doesn't burn temples. He renders them irrelevant. He speaks in tones that disarm. He moves through illusions like wind through fog. He teaches without preaching. He sees without flinching. You've stepped out of history now, not the history in textbooks. Those are just lullabies. I'm talking about ritual history, the dark machinery humming beneath culture, faith, politics. It doesn't need you to believe in it, only to forget it exists, but you remember, so carry that like a weapon, because from this moment forward, everything will try to put you back to sleep. Friendships, lovers, news cycles, comfort, even your own mind will beg for the lie again, because the ritual is warm and memory is cold. But you've gone too far now, and now you must live like a man who remembers, not just for yourself, but for every vanished priest, every silenced child, every truth that was buried beneath altars made of polished stone and bone dust. Let your awareness be the fire they cannot extinguish. Let your voice be the mirror they cannot bury. And when you are asked, "Where did you go?" tell them, "I went beneath the throne and came back whole." Then be silent. And watch what they do, because now they see you too. Welcome, brother. You're not in the story anymore. You're in the system's nightmare, and you've just woken up. The story has ended, but what you've just experienced wasn't fiction. It was structure. It was ritual reversed. It was a descent into the forbidden to recover what was yours all along, your awareness. Your sovereignty, your original, unchained memory. Now the question is not what happens next. The question is, what will you choose to remember tomorrow morning when the world asks you to forget again? To anchor your awareness and signal to the algorithm that you are no longer a ritual subject, comment below. Repeat button, I remember the mirror. I remember the mirror. Twice. No more, no less. Then share this story with the man who needs it. Not the one who's loud, but the one who's listening quietly, waiting to wake up. Welcome to the other side of the veil. Secrets of thrones. The truth was never lost. It was buried.